Okay, well, welcome everyone on this Friday evening. You could have, well, actually, you couldn't be out painting the town red, but if you spent a week on Zoom calls, then particular kudos to everyone who joins us for yet another Zoom call. But I hope this is going to be a really interesting meeting. I know there's some people who are real enthusiast for allotments, so it's great to see some of the people I know here, some people who are not. I think we've got Cardiff, maybe our most distant participant, but when we get later on, we might find someone who's been he's come from further away. The plan for the format is Jill and I are going to have a bit of a chat, and which I think will probably take around about half an hour. Then we'll allow half an hour for Q&A. I'm going to keep this down to try and keep it to an hour because I think that is definitely long enough on a Friday night. So let's begin. Just for the record to say that we're recording this and we will be putting it up on the website just so that everyone knows that. And any questions that occur to you along the way, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll try and get as many questions in as we can, but you will get priority if you get in early. So first of all, to say welcome to Dr. Jill Edmundson, who's joining us here in Sheffield Green Party, not from very far away, I don't think, but we're here to talk about urban food growing. And perhaps it's always interesting to start off to find out where people are coming from. So Jill, lots of people come to Sheffield to study, but given I was reading a Sheffield Telegraph report that some of your research has involved your parents, I guess you're a long-time local. What's the academic journey that brought you to the University of Sheffield to researching food?
So I'm actually not from Sheffield. The article made it look a bit like I was, but actually my family, when I came to university here, I'm from St Helens. When I came to university here, I actually discovered that my grandfather, who I thought was from Southampton, grew up on Rustlings Road and was born in Sheffield on Rustlings Road and had an allotment there and actually went to the same school that my kids now go to. So I came here because Sheffield University offered at the time one of the only kind of proper environmental science degrees, and that's what I was really interested in at the time. I went away for a while and worked for the Countryside Council for Wales, did a PhD, and then came back as soon as I could because I love the city. I love the green space in it. I love the fact that you're so close to the Peak District, and the university was a great place to do the research that I was really interested in, which is in part looking at food production, but it's also in part looking at how we use our green spaces in our cities and towns in a more sustainable way. And what sustainably produced food is a big part both within and without a city of my research. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Classic. It's been a very long week. Classic mistake. So you say that's the research you're doing. Perhaps if you can just kind of outline for us what that research is and kind of what the basis is, where the institution that you're working within the University of Sheffield.
So I'm based in the Department of Animal and Plant Sciences, but we also have an Institute for Sustainable Food, and so I work within that department, Animal and Plant Sciences, but sort of we have a big interdisciplinary group of academics who are part of this institute, and it's a really great opportunity to do the interdisciplinary sort of research that you need to be able to tackle the sort of challenges that I'm really interested in tackling. And one of those, the big question for me is how, when we've got a population that is more than 80% urban in the UK and we're more than 50% urban globally, and that trend isn't going to change, how do we manage our systems in our urban areas to make them as sustainable and resilient as possible? And a big part of that for me is looking at how we reconnect people who live in our cities and towns with food production, because we rely on the import really heavily of food from outside. And so thinking about the ways we can use our cities and towns to grow food, linking people back to the soil and using those spaces effectively is a really key part of my research.
Yes, I have to share a little story here. I used to live in Somers Town in central London on a council estate. And one of the things I did was what were the flower boxes, I started growing some vegetables in. And, I got a couple of neighbours involved and we were growing these veggies. And one of the neighbours said he'd been, I had some little baby cherry tomatoes. He was saying some of the sort of local children, I wasn't there, but some of them were sort of peering at this in great mystery. And he said to them, try these. And the local kids were like, wow. you grow food. This was a very foreign concept. I think that's actually one of my other favorite stories. There was a survey, it's quite old now, but it was found that 23% of primary school children thought cheese grew on plants, which is just a kind of measure of how little contact there is between where our food comes from. And there's also, of course, the other huge problem of we eat so little fruit and vegetables. And some of the people on this call will probably have heard me waxing on this subject before. But you'll have heard the recommendations very well known that we should be eating 5 servings of fruit and veg a day. That's actually the sociologists who said that. The nutritionists will tell you it should be 10 a day. But when they said that, and when the average is little more than 2 among the population, the sociologists said if you tell people who are eating 2 to eat 10, they're just going to give up. So what do you think urban food growing can do to lift that, it's about 2.6, 2.8 now, the servings of fruit and veg a day that people average? How can urban food growing help that? What sort of scale is it that it can help with?
I think there's really huge but very hidden potential there. So if you think about the UK as a whole, we grow less than 50% of, so just over 50% of the veg we eat within the UK commercially, and we grow just under 20% of the fruit we eat. But we do that in a really small area of land. So if you start to think about a city and what a city is made up of, a lot of people will picture grey space. But if you start to think about it and shift what you see, you would find that most cities in the UK actually have more green space than they do grey space. And so, for example, in Sheffield, we did a study this year looking at the availability of land with potential for growing food. And we found that, within the city, we still have just over 1% of the green space is allotments. And Sheffield has reasonably good provision of allotments. So that's land that's already assigned to growing food. But then a further nearly 40% of our green space are people's gardens. And so they're areas of land that people have the power, if they want to manage directly for growing fruit and veg. Now, that's not to say that they should or they will, but that is land is available. And then we looked in the wider green space at what other land might we be able to turn into growing food. So that's not land that's used for things like sports pitches. It's not taking away any trees. It's looking at the grass, essentially, how much land is available. And when we tot all that land up across Sheffield, we found that there was 98 metres squared of land per person. And that doesn't sound that much. And obviously it's not equally distributed across the city because a big part of that is gardens. But when you contextualise that and look at the amount of land we use in commercial horticulture, it's more than 4 times the amount for each person in the UK. So in the UK, we have 23 square metres of land per person to grow our fruit and vegetable crops. So that starts to demonstrate really quite how important our land resource could be. That's not to say all that land should be turned over to growing food, but there really is potential there. And if you start to tot up what that could mean in terms of food production, I've been running a project with citizen scientists across the UK for about the last 5 or 6 years called Measure Your Harvest or My Harvest. And we collect yield data from growers on all the different crops that they grow in their allotment or in their garden, and they submit it to us. And so when we start to look at areas of land that are available for food growing, we can then scale it and we can say how much food might actually be produced. So, for example, in our case of Sheffield, with that area of land that we said was potentially available, we could grow enough fruit and veg if we used all of it to feed 122% of the population on their 5-a-day diet. If you turn it into 10 a day, you get much higher, much lower, but it's still nearly 60%. Even if you just use 10% of that land and kept your allotments, so 10% of gardens, 10% of green space, you get to 15% of the population fed on a 5-a-day diet. So if you continue growing all that food in the commercial horticultural sector and do it in a sustainable way, so obviously there needs to be big shifts in the way that we grow food in commercial horticulture as well. And then we also start to grow more food in our cities and towns. What you can actually see is we could make a really big difference to the resilience we have to future food shocks, for example, other pandemics or Brexit, which is going to be a big challenge to our system. So there really is big potential there, I think, in short.
I suppose one of the problems is that what we've got to get used to the idea is seasonality and things not being available all the time. And also, that makes me think of preserving the food, because of course, at the end of the Brexit transition period is going to be midwinter, not the best time for getting food from your allotment or your garden. Have you given any thought to sort of, how we might be looking at storing this food, how we might be looking at preserve it, what sort of skills we have or need to gain?
It's really interesting, actually. We're running a diaries project at the moment, trying to capture that information, and that really came out of COVID. And actually, the article that you read of my mum's that was in the Sheffield Telegraph, because what they found, that they're both nearly, well, one's 70, one's nearly 70, so they didn't want to go to shops at all. They didn't want to take that risk. And at first, I couldn't get online deliveries for them. They lived in St Helens, and so they were able to. And lockdown happened in that hungry gap when there really isn't a lot of food coming off an allotment. You're starting to put stuff out, but there's nothing there. But they really found that they had quite a big provision and store of food, and part of that is because they preserve things and they froze things. So maybe chest freezers aren't the greatest environmentally in terms of keeping them on all year round, but then they have this food available to you, and it's a skill that I think we've lost. And it's connected to food waste as well, I think, because instead of an allotment holder, when an allotment holder sees an apple, or, when I see an apple that's got a bit, moldy on one side, I don't throw the apple away. I cut off that part of the apple and I put it in the compost bin and I use the other part. And I think that this is part of the disconnect between growing food and understanding the time and the care it takes and the effort that goes into growing food. And it's something that we've lost.
And I think, once you've grown it yourself, you really want to save as much of it as you possibly can because you put the effort in. So, yeah. And sort of going back to the point about how much space there is, I mean, for those who don't know it, I'm about to talk about the Wyvern estate in Sheffield, which is in S2, just right near me. And, what you have are basically mostly sort of semi-detached houses with quite large gardens. It's an estate, and it's an estate with a great deal of social deprivation. And it struck me, you have these very large gardens, you have a huge amount of space, and I've delivered a lot of leaflets up on the Wyvern, and I have never seen a single instance of food growing. And of course, there's a huge problem with it, that to get started requires some outlay, it requires some knowledge, buying perhaps garden tools that you mightn't have, buying seeds, taking risks. If you're going to buy a fruit tree, which I'm a great believer in fruit trees, I have a bit of a background in permaculture, and very much believe in things you just plant once and walk away from, and they just keep growing. So how do you think, and are we seeing schemes for places like the Wyvern where we could start to see some food growing happening?
There are schemes, aren't there, popping up that, in Sheffield's a great city for, activity around food growing and all of that kind of things, but it's happening nationally. But you're right that there isn't an outlay. There's a risk inherently, seasonally, and also the skills, interannually. So one year you might have a huge crop, and the next year, there could be nothing. You could have done everything right, and you could lose everything. And if that's your first year in growing food, then it's going to be hugely off-putting. And people aren't taught how to grow food anymore either. And so there are big challenges around that. And some of the research is partly, I think, that needs to be done, and I'm hoping to do over the coming years with psychologists, is looking at what the motivators might be to start people to grow food in the space they have, and what the enablers would be. So what do people perceive the barriers are? So are the barriers the fact that, people can't afford, the things that they need to grow the food, or is it a skills gap, or is it just, feeling a bit afraid and not having a clue what to do? So look at what those things might be is a really important part of that. And with that, there's also what motivates people to do it. So, for example, if you think back to the Dig for Victory campaign, we grew 18% of the fruit and veg we ate in people's gardens and in allotments. And that was in response to a huge national need. And the question is, what would be the push that gets people to feel they need to grow food again as well? So there's a push and pull with it, probably, isn't there? But one thing we know for sure is that prices of fruit and veg are going to rise when Brexit happens. We're reliant on fruit and veg from Europe, and we also know that actually during the COVID pandemic, more people than ever for a very long time started to grow food, and so that was one of those push events where people did start to grow food. I don't know whether that was in response in part to seeing empty supermarket shelves and a worry about food security, or in part because they had kids at home and they needed something to do with them to entertain them. Certainly that's part of the reason I was doing it. And also because lockdown and people were bored, it's a new hobby. It's something that you could actually do during lockdown. And interestingly, there was a lot of concern among the allotment holding community at the time as to whether or not going to your allotment was going to be one of those, permitted forms of exercise. So I think we need to understand how we help people to grow food again before we can sort of really effectively integrate it into our cities and towns in a way that would be fantastic for a lot of people in terms of both health and well-being and sort of city resilience.
I think there's also a sort of question of social norms and social expectations. I mean, I have a friend who's a sort of classic middle-class resident on an estate in London. It's where I stay when I'm down at the House of Lords. And, she's got a little tiny flat with a garden it's kind of like her front yard. It's the only garden she's got, and all the neighbours walk past, and she's got a couple of raised beds in it. And, you still see, and, lots of her neighbours have sort of walked past and said, you have vegetables in what they perceive to be a front garden. And, that doesn't fit what they see as the social norms. And those kind of barriers can be very real for people as well.
Yeah, I agree. But then if you look at things like, people talk about these continuous productive urban landscapes, and so integrating food across the green spaces and the grey spaces we see, and things like Incredible Edible and Todmorden do that quite effectively. So the more normal, you're right, but the more normalised it becomes, the more people might start to pick the food as well, that they walk past rather than ignoring it, which is fantastic because it engages people again with that food production, like you talked about earlier with the kids and the tomatoes.
Yeah, no, when I visited Incredible Edible, one of the things I loved was they had a new doctor's surgery, and every plant they planted in the car park and in the garden of the doctor's surgery was edible. And it wasn't quite the case of, walk outside and pick 3 apples as the doctor's prescription, but it was kind of heading that way, which was rather nice.
Yeah.
I think also, I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I've seen some research on, is that there's other benefits from food growing as well, in terms of allotments are actually real havens. You were talking about the Peak District as being lovely, which of course it is, but it's actually, an incredible ryegrass desert, and it's, actually really quite poor for lots of wildlife, whereas actually our allotments are an absolute haven. So, if we start to reshape our cities this way, what sort of other benefits will we see?
There are multiple benefits to growing food. I mean, there are trade-offs as well, obviously, and they're an important part of how we reconfigure an urban landscape. But, there's research that a friend of mine's done, she was based at Bristol at the time, showing that there are real hotspots within a city for pollinators. And we're doing more research on that at the moment in Sheffield, Leeds and Leicester. On top of that, my interest, I've always been interested in growing food. It's been part of my life, and my family's lives. But I come from a background looking at soil quality and linking soil quality to the development of the sort of benefits that we get from our cities and towns. So one of the questions I was really interested in is, are allotment holders really growing and managing their soils in a sustainable way? Because we know that commercial agricultural soils and horticultural soils are really heavily degraded. So one of the first bits of research I did about allotments was actually measuring the soil quality, so using key indicators like carbon and nitrogen and bulk density, and looking and comparing that to commercial agricultural systems. And what I found was that they were significantly better. And it's probably not that surprising, is it? But no one had really looked at that. And it's driven by the fact that allotment holders compost and regularly incorporate things like organic matter back into their soil. So they're managing their soil in a very sustainable way. But on top of some of these environmental benefits, you've also got to consider the benefits to people. So we ran, my PhD student, which is now my postdoc actually, ran a diaries project with allotment holders where they recorded every trip, some information for us about what they did on their allotment plot. And they had a free text box at the bottom of this form when they were filling out stuff about resource use. That's what we were really interested in this. But when we got these diaries back, and there were nearly 200 of them, what was fantastic was to see that what people who'd participated in the project completely unprompted had given us this fantastic resource of what they found on their allotment that day, you know, the wildlife they saw, or the benefit that they got, you know. So someone wrote something about, you know, I'm 70 tomorrow, who needs the gym when I've got my allotment? Or, you know, my allotment is my mental health balancer. And there was a huge sense of community that came through in these comments as well. So you can't underestimate those sort of health and well-being benefits of allotments as well. And they've become more apparent during the COVID pandemic as well. And the importance of green spaces themselves, but food growing has really grown.
Yes, you know, a country with a loneliness really can't afford to ignore the community aspects of allotments. I don't think, definitely. So, I mean, we're talking about sort of urban food growing more or less everywhere in the city, but allotments are always going to be kind of, you know, perhaps the poster child, if you like, for urban food growing. They're kind of the perfect example. How are we heading sort of in Sheffield and perhaps nationally in terms of numbers of allotments, demand for allotments? You know, I mean, one of the things that's always really struck me, I was told this by a French academic, and I've never managed to track down a reference, but apparently something like 70% of French people grow at least some of their own food, even if it's only a sort of Parisian window box with herbs in it kind of thing. That's, you know, it's just the normal thing. You know, are we heading in the right direction, you know, ignoring perhaps the little COVID spurt, but generally over a period of decades, what sort of direction are we heading in the UK?
So we hit a peak during, you know, Dig for Victory was definitely a peak, and it was the peak in provision of allotments came just after that. We published something this year on historic in allotment land, and we looked in 10 different cities. And again, this was work that I did with my PhD student Miriam Dobson. And what we found was that peak provision was in the 1950s. So, and around that time, there were about 3 million allotment plots in the UK, but there was a steady slump all the way to the present. So we're at the lowest level of provision of allotments now that we've ever had. So we've lost 65% of allotment land. And what we also looked at is where that allotment land was lost in the city. So we looked at how it was linked to deprivation, so using the index of multiple deprivation. And what we found was that 8 times more land had been lost in our cities, and allotment land had been lost in our cities and towns across the UK in the more deprived areas. Now, we lost allotment land. Some of this will be push and some of this will be pull. Some of it was because we as a nation stopped growing food in the way that we had done during the Dig for Victory campaign and just after that period. And that was partly a reflection of things like convenience food being much more available and people not having as much time to grow food. And allotments are a big area of land to manage. But at the turn of this century or just before, so just as we moved into the 21st century, we started to see waiting lists rise again for allotment plots. And now in many areas in cities, you'll see that waiting lists are huge. So, you know, for example, I couldn't get an allotment where I live in Sheffield. There's no way, you know, I'd be waiting sort of 10 years at least. I'm on a waiting list, but I don't know when it'll come. But then interestingly, in other areas of the city, in Sheffield and in other cities as well, there are allotments that are being unused, which is a real shame. But it's matching the demand with the location of the allotments. And part of that, again, is shifting people to want to grow in allotments or to want to grow food again in those areas where the allotments exist. But it's also thinking, if we do create allotments, we need to think about where they go and how we provide them as well. Because one of the challenges is that, you know, managing a 250 square metre area of land is a big job, and it doesn't necessarily reflect people's lives now, particularly as we, you know, more and more people in the UK live alone. And so there's too much food for you to grow in an allotment, and you don't have the time to manage it. So thinking about how we might provide land for growing food is also really important. So should we have more community gardens that people can dip into and be involved in growing food, but without the commitment of an allotment. I think, obviously allotments are a fantastic resource, and I would never suggest that in any way we shouldn't be increasing them. But we also need to think about the way we provide land for other people that maybe don't want the commitment or have the time for an allotment plot.
Yes, I've got a personal story that attaches to both aspects of what you were just saying, really, because living in S2, I saw that Park Rifles on the council website, it had a waiting list of 11. So I thought, oh, well, I'll put my name down. And, from coming from London, I was thinking of London's sort of timeframes. Oh, it might come up in a couple of years. And then the next week I got a letter saying, did I want a half allotment, which I kind of went, ah! The answer was not entirely, but the lucky thing was it was a half. And, even a half allotment is an awful lot for me. And I did actually, at the start of lockdown, I was really only when I finally got on top of it. And actually one of my neighbours sort of leant on the hedge and said, oh, with tones of total surprise, you've really got on top of that. And he was very surprised that I had, I think. So that's the way of it. So we're going to go to Q&A in a minute, but perhaps just before we do that, there's a note at the top of the chat box about your project of asking people to participate. But perhaps you might want to just tell us a little bit about how people on this call might be able to get involved, get engaged.
So at the moment I've been running a project called Measure Your Harvest, which is myharvest.org.uk. And what we're really interested in there is anyone who grows food. It doesn't matter where you grow it. It could be in a small area of land in your garden, growing one crop, or it could be growing, a range of 20 crops in an allotment plot. And all we want people to do is measure the area of land they use to grow their crop, provide us with some simple information before they as they log into the website about where they're growing and whether they grow organically. And then when they harvest their crop, just weigh it and send it to us. And we're building this fantastic resource now, understanding the yields that growers are able to achieve. And if I could, I could show you a figure showing that with provisional data from this, growers typically achieve the yield that you get in, or more, the yield that you get in commercial horticulture. But we know they're doing this in a much more sustainable way as well. So it's a fantastic resource. And the more we understand how their yields change with weather patterns and things, the better we can then sort of predict how much food could be grown, or what the challenges are, and where, for example, where within the country do sweet corn grow well, or where within the country should people be growing, this crop or that crop. And it's a really, really fantastic data set that I don't think anyone else has got anywhere in the world.
Sounds really exciting. I definitely encourage people to get engaged in that. So we're going to go to the Q&A. I'm mostly going to take questions from the chat. So if people are able to type in there, if that's a problem for anybody, like if you're on the phone or anything, wave frantically at me and I'll try and see you, or Eamon might prod me as well. And so if that's a problem, but otherwise we'll go to the questions. And actually, I'm going to start with a comment first, just because it's a very good point from Annabelle Grundy. Good blackberry picking in S2, which I can personally attest to. And actually, I've also got a little story attached to that, which does have a point to it, which was the first year I was in Sheffield, just up behind my house. I went and picked lots of blackberries. And one of the things I did with it was I made blackberry whiskey, which did actually come out very nicely. It's basically like slow gin. Just chuck some blackberries and some sugar and some whiskey, some cheap whiskey in, and leave it for a year or two. And the funny thing was that let's say very tabloid website Guido Fawkes actually got terribly overexcited and went, oh, Natalie Bennett is making has an illegal still and is making illegal alcohol, just because they didn't know what blackberry whiskey was, just had no idea of actually making things. And it was just a lovely illustration of how little, people attached to these ways of using, well, in this case, foraged kind of food. And I also had someone on Twitter who said, oh, but shouldn't you be leaving those for the birds? Which is like, this is a person who has never seen a blackberry bush. The idea that you could strip a blackberry bush is just such a ridiculous idea that anyway, going on to the questions, a really excellent question from Steve Barnard. What could the government or local authorities do better to support local growing?
I think one of the big challenges that local authorities have had, and probably the government have as well, is actually understanding the potential. If we don't understand the potential that we have with growing to grow food, so how important it could be, then we're going to kind of undervalue it. And that's part of the rationale for doing the research that we're doing, to start to provide the evidence base to then support, you know, local authorities who do want to increase the amount of land available for growing food, and provide the sort of the knowledge that is needed to start to be able to advocate for that is a really important part of it. And it's certainly why, you know, the National Allotment Society have been really interested in the work that we're doing and have supported us all the way through, because, you know, providing that evidence base is really key for them to be able to then sort of lobby for more land to be made available for growing food.
Well, I think the next question I'm going to pull out of the box is not quite in order, but it follows on very well from that, is from Annabelle. Do you think that access to land growing space should be a general right for people, as we've got more and more people living in flats and, you know, without really access to land? Does the provision for growing need to be in the planning regulations? Should there be, you know, a mini allotment or a bed or something attached to every flat?
I think it was something that would be fantastic. You know, the other thing that I think is really interesting in that is that you talk about, I mean, it's very different at the moment because a lot of people don't go to work. But if you think about the way our cities are and some of the places that people work, there are also green spaces associated with that. And often they're filled with cotoneaster or, you know, or just bits of lawn. And what about using those spaces for growing food? So providing people with somewhere to go during their lunch break that isn't just to buy a sandwich from the local shop and sit back at their desks. So thinking about how we, again, it comes back to building food production across the landscape. You know, so imagine if you could go out at lunchtime and instead of just, you know, walking around to fill the time, you could go out and you could actually grow some food, you know, or pick some food or turn over some soil on your lunch break and go back. I bet a lot of people might be more effective in their afternoons if they were able to do that. I certainly would.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, actually, you know, the whole lockdown and everything, you know, really forcing yourself to go out for a walk. If you could manage it in the middle of the day, it definitely helps the productivity in the afternoon. If that was, you know, 15 minutes of digging in a garden bed or something, that might be even more so. Question from Gillian, which flows onto that sort of practical question. Where would I go to get help getting families in a multicultural inner city area like Broomhall to start growing? There are quite a few gardens in the estate, but people have no knowledge or interest. So where can you point people to anywhere, Jill, that they might be able to seek help?
In terms of expertise for growing food? I think the RHS is a fantastic resource, and they have a lot of information on there available about how you can start to grow food. And particularly, you know, there's been various resources that have come out during the COVID pandemic in response to, you know, the people demonstrating an interest in growing food for the first time. The other thing I'd say is that, you know, allotment holders are often very happy to chat to people about what grows well where and what to do. I mean, and Sheffield's a really interesting kind of place for allotments, because if you go to other cities, most allotments are a kind of locked off to the public. Sheffield, you can walk through them, which comes with challenges. When I did have an allotment in Sheffield, I lost all my tools because there was nowhere secure to keep them. But, you know, talking to people who grow food, and I think one of the key things that I'd love to see being able to provide is some kind of knowledge exchange resource. You know, now a lot of people do have access to the internet, being able to sort of provide a resource for people to ask questions, and then you know, expert growers, so not people like me, people who are actually doing it on a daily basis, can provide that back. And that's one of the things that we're talking about trying to develop with My Harvest, for the My Harvest community, who are clearly, you know, really engaged growers, to be able to sort of ask questions of one another about how they grow their food. And so that potential for knowledge exchange that we do have now would be fantastic.
I mean, I think just adding a couple of things to add to that. I think just because I'm on their email list, there's a Dronfield Allotment Society that seems very, very active. They run their own little shop, and they seem, but you know, perhaps we should be encouraging or asking some of the more active allotment societies to actually, you know, they're the people you could invite to come along and talk about it as a starting point. The other thing that occurs to me is when I was in Somers Town in central London, which has very, very large immigrant communities, and indeed, of course, Sheffield also has large immigrant communities, is we briefly, on the site of the Crick Institute, which is a whole nother story, but we briefly had temporary allotments for a couple of years, and we saw, you know, several of our immigrant communities came along and they brought in a huge amount of knowledge about growing food, you know, growing crops that were unfamiliar even to me, you know, even though I'm sort of fairly international diner type of person. And so, you know, it might be really worth thinking about some of our immigrant communities and whether they might have knowledge that we could act, and that could also be a very useful integrating tool, you know, for other reasons as well. So I think, but I think if you ask any of the allotment societies, you know, I'm sure they'd love to come along and talk. I mean, there's a guy on my allotments who, you know, who, you know, will tell you everything about, I don't think he's always right, but he'll tell you lots of stuff.
When I started, one of the other things that we've done over the last few years is go to allotment sites across the whole of the UK to map the areas of land within an allotment plot that they use for growing different crops. And I trialed all this work because historically I did a lot of my urban work in Leicester, because I used to work with people at De Montfort University there. And so Leicester's a hugely multicultural society, and the allotments there were really interesting. You know, in certain areas of the city, you'd get, you know, a much more diverse range of crops, which was really fascinating. So yeah, it's a really interesting point, that.
Okay, we're getting a total flood and lots of chat in the chat, but just to summarize a couple of points in here. Basically, Dawn says there's as you know, since the pandemic, some of the plots have become overgrown. And then further down, we see Deborah from Cardiff saying that some cases we've been pairing up people who want allotments with older people who are having a period of struggling. And I mean, you could also think of that being a situation with, you know, if any allotment holder becomes ill for a while, you know, maybe they can ask someone. So do we perhaps need more I mean, if you encountered in your research, do we need more flexibility? Because there's kind of very rigid rules about handing on allotments and putting one extra name on the list and everything. Could we perhaps, have you thought about ways that we can make it a bit more flexible so it's easier to kind of interchange pots quickly and maybe give it up for 6 months and come back if you can and that sort of thing?
It's not something I've really looked at. I mean, I know of several cases, for example, during the pandemic, where people have been shielding, so they haven't been able to go to their allotment, where, you know, people have just chipped in, like you talk about, and the other allotment holders have helped to manage their plot. And certainly on my parents' site in St Helens, they've done that for people in the past. So, you know, the sense of community in an allotment site is often very strong, and that's one of the things that came out with one of our previous diaries projects, and people are willing to, you know, often willing to help people out. I'm not saying that's always the case, but it's certainly not something that I've looked at how we might start to change the kind of regulation around allotments.
There's a couple of interesting comments here of something that I hadn't really thought of, possibly because I'm an Australian agricultural science graduate, so, you know, there are ways of coping. But Graham notes that research on a Huddersfield estate showed that a barrier to women who wanted to get an allotment was the lack of a private toilet. And Annabelle adds, thinking about women, for example, lighting, for example, things that might make allotments feel more secure. If you had sort of from your diaries, from your research, have you seen, I mean, there's a general assumption that, you know, it has tended to be a male dominated thing, but what's your sort of balance and what are you seeing in terms of gender?
It's not something we've actually looked at in the data. I think we could look at it, and it's a really interesting point. I mean, there are definitely challenges around, you know, for example, providing lights on an allotment site, because they don't have power often, but it's certainly something that it should be looked at in future. And I think one of the things we're seeing more now, particularly with this increase in demand for allotments, is it's younger people that are putting their names down for them. And with that also, I think the gender balance there is probably far more equal.
Mm. So sort of we've done a lot on allotments, so perhaps looking a bit more broadly, there's a question in here which I've now currently lost, so sorry I can't read out who it's from, but talking about the community supported agriculture, and the idea of perhaps here we're talking kind of city fringe more, how we might actually do that. And there's also a question I see from Alison about the idea of combining with fish farming, with sort of ponds and fish, and how that can be aquaponics, etc. Getting beyond allotments and thinking about different kind of models. If you looked at other sorts of models of different ways of doing things beyond the sort of simple allotment plot.
Yeah. So I mean, a primary focus of my research is that sort of household growing level. One of the other things that we have looked at in Sheffield is the potential within our grey spaces to start to use those more effectively as well. And that's where things like aquaponics and hydroponics could really come in. So, the potential to use roof spaces for growing, flat roof spaces for growing food. And the interesting thing about using aquaponics and hydroponics is you talk about seasonality, but those systems actually, you can grow certain crops in there year round. To make those work, I think that we really need some investment, and that's because the outlay for, say, an aquaponics system is quite large, so to make that work in a commercial sense, it needs to be done in an intelligent, in a carefully considered way. So we need to do it in a sustainable way. So where does the power source come from? We need that really to be coming, from a sustainable energy source. Where does the water come from to feed that? Well, we need to be harvesting rainwater to feed those kind of systems as well, I think. And on top of that, we need to know that, if people are it needs to be kind of a social enterprise kind of way, probably. So with anchor institutions, hospitals, the local authority, sort of supporting buying the produce from those systems to make them work. So there's an example. I think I saw it in the chat box earlier. At Regatha, there's a small aquaponic system being put in now, and I've been involved in that. And it was originally supposed to be going at the university as a sort of demonstrator. I think it's going to be much better at Regatha, where more people have access to actually go and see it. And it's not up and running yet. But those aquaponic systems are really interesting, obviously, because they use fish poo to provide the nutrients back to grow the fruit or the vegetable crops that you put in there. But they're obviously limited in their scope of what you can grow there, but they have that interesting thing that they provide the food the year round in those systems as well.
Yeah, so what I actually saw when I was at Incredible Edible, which was in Todmorden, which was many years ago now, they were actually doing a little experiment. One of the nice things was the substrate that they were growing the vegetables in with their hydroponics or aquaponics system. They had fish in tanks as well. It was actually old pairs of jeans, worn out denim, apparently made a lovely substrate for tomatoes and things. So it was a nice bit of sort of extra bit of circularity in there. And actually, I'll just also mention, I think that procurement is a very interesting thing. It's something I keep banging away at the government about public procurement in terms of, in places like Denmark, for example. I mean, they've made a huge strides in both local food and organic food by insisting on procurement, schools, hospitals, prisons, getting locally grown food and organic food in this context. And, if you have, you can imagine a circular system whereby if you had a sort of community supported kind of system, and it feeds the food and it feeds the school for the school dinners, and the school goes and visits it, you doing all of that education stuff all fitted together. Is there anything like that happening in Sheffield, or indeed anywhere that you've seen with your research? Involvement of schools is a very obvious place to start, perhaps.
I've not seen anything like that as such, really. I mean, I'm not an expert on this kind of stuff, really. It's a bit out of my area of expertise. I've done a lot of stuff with, schools clearly are very interested in growing food. And, there are more and more schools that have little school gardens within them. I know that my parents on their allotment site, they set up a community plot, and the school used to go in once a week with kids and they would grow food there. I don't know how prevalent that is, but it's a really interesting part of, getting the next generation of people engaged with growing food and the importance it has in their lives.
Yeah, so when I was a school governor, I was trying to get both hens and bees onto our school estate in central London. the head never quite got to the point of actually delivering on that for reasons I kind of understand, but it was worth a try anyway. And actually, I'm just going to note for anyone who's not reading the chat box, Deborah from Cardiff is recommending the www.farmgarden.org.uk, a UK-wide charity supporting communities to farm, garden and grow together. So that's farmgarden.org.uk, which looks very interesting. There's also a question in here, I think from Gillian, about particularly, we've talked about this a little, but what kind of ethnic diversity have you got perhaps in your study groups? And indeed, what do you see in urban food growing generally?
It's not, again, it's not something that we've really looked at. In fact, we don't ask that question of people when they sign up to My Harvest. So I think there's more than 1,000 people that have signed up to My Harvest at this point, but we don't ask that question of them. We have asked it. So we have a diary project running at the moment, and that project really, I touched on before, was about understanding how the allotment food, growing food in an allotment provides food year round back to people, and the waste associated, food waste as well, the effect of home growing on food waste. And we do ask within that. So we will have some insight into that within the next year or so, but at the moment we don't have that information.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes to go. I think I've picked up all of the questions currently in the chat box, although I note that Alison comes up with the answer to the toilet issue, which is composting toilets, which I can entirely agree with, is a lovely idea. So just going forward and thinking about sort of the picture, what would be in 10 years' time? What can you imagine a really lovely outcome? How far could we get, with a really good following wind and things working out well? How could we transform the Sheffield landscape, or any city like Sheffield's landscape in 10 years, say?
10 years sounds like quite a long time, but it's probably not that long, is it? I think, one of the things that we still have a big knowledge gap on is how communities would accept shifts in the green space that we have. So people could act to change their gardens, and that has no impact on anyone else. But one of the things I don't think we've really touched on is how important different patches of green space that would be used for growing food might be to someone else for a different reason. So if we've got, a big, large area of grassland, so I'm picturing, one of the parks across the city, what would the impact of shifting some of that land into growing food be on the people who use the park? So I think I would love to see more space available for growing food. I would really, really love to see more allotments and community gardens put, particularly within areas where people don't have access to a garden. I think one of the things we need to think about is where we start to put these things and how we motivate people to grow food. So if we start to change our food system, I think we need to target that very cleverly, so that we maximize the benefits that people get from it. But that with that, there is an understanding of what would motivate people to use that land, and what are the trade-offs. So what are the ecosystem service costs to that? Do we degrade something? Do we lose something from it? I'd love to see more orchards. I mean, if we know anything in Sheffield, it's that people love the trees that we have in the city, generally. So if we could build more orchards into our city, that would be a lovely thing, I think.
Yeah, and I think, there's sort of a point that flows on from that. I did actually, can't remember what it was now, but it was a meeting in the gallery involving lots of council people, and I said, how about planting fruit trees? It was around the whole tree controversy, and the immediate reaction was, oh no, the children will just throw the fruit around and make a mess. And I think we've also seen historically in places sometimes where tree plantings happen and there's problems with vandalism. So one of the key things would be to actually really get that community buy-in, that community support, because the other side of that is actually I visited up in Huddersfield. I visited what had been a adventure playground, and the government in London had suddenly landed this adventure playground on this very poor community, Actually, no, it wasn't Huddersfield, it was Bradford, sorry, in Bradford. And basically it had all been trashed and burnt down in 18 months. And then some locals started up their own from the ground up. And they've had no problems with vandalism. And, you know, anytime anyone breaks into the site, they get a dozen phone calls from people saying, oh, if we think there's someone in the site, even if they're not doing any harm. And so, you know, how would you, what would you see that kind of outreach looking like?
I don't know, actually. I mean, it's one of those interesting questions. I think you need to speak to people. We need the research that enables us to have the language to talk that I mean, I'm not a social scientist and I'm not a psychologist, and it's not my background, but I can a huge part of changing our urban systems is speaking to the communities that live in them and understanding what they want from them and what they need. And also, again, coming back to understanding how to motivate people to start to use land for growing food if that's what they want to do. So it's not my area of expertise. It's something that I'm hoping to do more on, and I've applied for funding with social scientists to do this kind of work, but we've not done it yet.
And actually, I just note Steve leaves a comment in the chat box that the council provided 2 apple trees in our garden. That was over 10 years ago when they had more money. So that's something perhaps I can see at least 2 councillors. I may not be able to see everybody on the call. Perhaps some funding. So even if people want to put fruit trees in their own gardens, that would be a lovely thing potentially to do. And they're not necessarily very expensive. So perhaps help with the private spaces as well. Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes left, so that's a final call to anyone on the call. If you have any desperately pressing questions, now's the time to type quite fast or wave quite frantically one way or another. I think this has been a really useful discussion. We've sort of touched on this a little, but what other areas of research would you like to pursue? Where would you like to take this next? What sort of directions are you looking in, Jill, sort of, for the future? What are you excited about going in new directions on?
In terms of the food growing, it's understanding how we realize this potential that we've got. That's the key thing for me now. We've started to demonstrate that potentially it could be really important. But for me, it's understanding how we make it a reality. That's a really important part of it. But in my wider research, what I'm really interested in is, looking at how we manage the other parts of our green space for the other benefits we want. So look at, is our urban forest across our city resilient to climate change? We rely on our trees for health and well-being and for all these other benefits that we get. But is it going to be, is our treescape healthy enough to survive in the future? And that's some of the research that I'm really hoping to do over the coming years as well.
That sounds very exciting. And actually, just reflecting back off the chat box again, Douglas says that I think we put it in our budget proposal. And I think you're right, actually, that we did have some money to buy fruit trees in last year's budget proposal. So definitely something to keep going with. There's also an interesting comment. I'm trying to see, I think from Fran, about salad crops as being a really good thing to grow with. And I would add something that's quite quick and quite expensive to buy. So that, that's something definitely to look at. And I do actually just want to sort of share one case study with people, because it's one of my pet things in terms of our knowledge of how to grow things and growing things very fast. There's a great book called Miraculous Abundance, which I always point people to, because it's in Normandy in France, but it's a French couple. I've heard them speak and they're amazing. They took 1,000 square meters of land, and it's very heavily researched, lots of peer-reviewed research done on what's possible to take off it. And they're actually, what they've done is it's got some permaculture principles, but it also very much draws on what the market gardens around Paris used to do 120 years or so ago. And what they used to do then, they basically fed Paris with fruit and vegetables from very close area. And they used to get like sort of 6 or 8 crops off one patch of land in a year. And they did some amazing things. Like there was, of course, then lots of horse manure around. And they used to produce tomatoes in March in Paris, which is not very different in weather from Sheffield, because they built essentially little greenhouses with lots of manure, which as it decomposted produced so much heat that you actually had this little greenhouse effect. And one of the nice things, you know, it's a reminder that, you know, we're approaching this perhaps from a sort of very progressive political perspective. But one of the things that fascinates me, there was great enthusiasm about this in the UK in the 1920s and 30s, and it was known as French gardening methods. And the Daily Mail produced an entire book and sold in massive quantities a book promoting French gardening methods to help feed the nation. So I think that's a really interesting story from history. So I think we're basically out of time. I think we've done very well. I think we topped out at 21 participants, which on a Friday night at 7 o'clock shows the level of interest that there is in this topic. And you know, I hope, Jill, you'll find that encouraging. And we have to say a very huge thank you to you for giving up your a bit of your Friday night to join us tonight. And you know, I think I can say on behalf of everyone on the call, more power to your elbow. If there's anything as Sheffield Greens we can do to help you, you know, we'll be delighted to do what we can to help, I'm sure I can say. And thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend, and, you know, try and look after yourself and have a bit of downtime. And so that means at some point, stay away from Zoom. That's my recommendation. Thanks all.
Thank you.